Alan pulled into the driveway just as the late afternoon sun cast long, soft shadows across the small brick house. He had never been a man to shy away from hard work, and when he agreed to marry Marie, he understood that he would be stepping into a situation already in motion. Marie had raised her son Darius on her own for nearly 16 years. Alan knew that becoming stepfather would not be a seamless transition. Adapting to a new family dynamic required patience and humility. As he stepped out of his car, he took a deep breath and reminded himself that this was more than just moving into a different home. It was about becoming part of someone else's life. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of lavender and homemade bread. Marie greeted him with a warm hug and a nervous smile. "Thanks for coming," she whispered. She looked around at the slightly worn furniture and the framed family photos on the walls, photos that featured Darius growing up with friends and family gatherings without Alan in them. Alan's heart softened at the sight. He wrapped an arm around Marie and said, "I'm ready for this." He could feel her tension ease slightly against him. They heard Darius's footsteps thudding down the stairs. He emerged from the darkness of the hallway, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression guarded. Darius was tall with a lean build that suggested he was still growing into his own body. Alan watched him closely. The boy's dark eyes flicked to Alan's face, sizing him up in an instant. Alan extended a hand cautiously. "I'm Alan," he said quietly. "I know this is all new for both of us." Darius did not take his hand. Instead, he looked away, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. For a moment, silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Alan met Darius's gaze again and offered a small, hopeful smile. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. Marie stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Darius's shoulder. "Leave him be for now," she murmured. "He'll come around." That evening, Alan explored his new space. The guest room was modest but clean, decorated with a few school trophies that Darius had left behind when he moved out of it. Alan could sense Darius's presence in every corner. The scuffed basketball hoop in the backyard, the guitar leaning against the wall in the living room, the stack of science fiction novels on the coffee table. Alan felt a pang of uncertainty. He wondered if repairing broken cabinets and fixing leaky faucets would be enough to earn Darius's wary respect. Over dinner, Alan tried to initiate conversation. He asked how Darius's day at school had been, what classes he enjoyed, if he had any weekend plans with friends. Darius barely nodded in response, picking at his food without making eye contact. Marie offered a gentle smile to Alan, her eyes reflecting both love and apology. "Give him time," she whispered later, as Alan washed dishes in the sink. "He's never had anyone else in our home like you." Alan rinsed a plate and stared at the soapy water swirling down the drain. He nodded, but didn't say much. Instead, he resolved to show up tomorrow and the day after, not just with tools to fix the house, but with a willingness to listen, learn, and be patient. He could only hope that by caring for their home and showing his genuine intentions, Darius would eventually see that Alan wasn't there to replace anyone. He was there to become part of their family. Broken cabinet doors, a loose faucet that dripped endlessly, peeling paint along the hallway walls. Alan noticed it all within the first week. Every evening after the sun dipped below the horizon and the house grew quiet, he would gather his tools from the garage and begin the work. At first, it was small fixes, tightening screws on kitchen cupboard hinges, replacing a worn-out washer in the bathroom sink. These were tasks he took on quietly, never announcing his intentions, simply moving through each room with a silent determination. Marie watched him from the doorway more than once. She would see him lying on his back under a sink, wrench in hand, sweat beading at his hairline despite the cool air of the house. She would step forward, place a comforting hand on his shoulder and whisper her gratitude. "Thank you," she'd say, her voice hushed so that Darius wouldn't overhear. Alan would wipe his hand on his worn jeans and offer a gentle smile. "Just doing what needs to be done," he'd reply. But even as Marie relaxed, feeling that perhaps this marriage could work after all, Darius only grew more distant. One afternoon, Alan climbed onto a small stool to replace a broken light fixture in the living room. The fixture had swayed for weeks, its cord frayed and unsafe. Darius came downstairs, headphones draped around his neck, and watched from the bottom step. His dark eyes followed every motion Alan made, from unscrewing the old fixture to connecting new wires and finally securing the fresh light in place. When Alan flicked the wall switch and the room filled with a warm glow, Marie clapped quietly, and Alan turned to see Darius's expression, arching an eyebrow, lips pressed in a thin line. "You just want to show off," Darius muttered under his breath as he walked past. Alan paused, looking at the perfectly aligned fixture. He felt a small ache in his chest, but he didn't reply. Instead, he climbed down, collected his tools, and continued on to the next broken thing, a crack in the window frame that let cold wind seep through on winter mornings. As days turned into weeks, the list of chores grew long. The bathroom tiles needed regrouting. The backyard fence leaned dangerously after last month's storm. The mailbox post leaned at a lopsided angle. Alan approached each task with the same quiet dedication. Late at night, when the world outside was dark and most would be asleep, he could be found deconstructing rotted wood, mixing fresh cement, and straightening the posts until they stood perfectly upright. Marie often wondered if Alan's efforts were all in vain. She saw Darius retreat further into his shell, retreating to his room with earphones, shutting out any chance of conversation. When she asked him why he wouldn't say thank you, Darius shrugged. "He doesn't get it," he'd snap. "This house doesn't need his help. It's fine." Marie felt a pang of helplessness, caught between wanting to defend Alan's kindness and respecting her son's feelings. One evening, Alan tackled a half-fixed pipe beneath the kitchen sink that had been leaking for months. Water stained the cabinet floor, turning the wood soft and discolored. Alan crawled in with a flashlight tucked between his teeth, carefully replacing the old pipe with a sturdier one. When he finally emerged from under the sink, he was soaked from the waist down, his shirt clinging to his back. Marie rushed to hand him a towel. Darius watched from the doorway but said nothing. Evening after evening, Alan continued to restore the house, room by room, corner by corner. And although Darius saw every nail driven and every brushstroke of paint, he refused to see Alan as anything more than an intruder, someone who appeared to care for the house, but, in Darius's eyes, only cared about asserting control. Yet Alan persisted, guided by a belief that actions, rather than words, would eventually bridge the gap between them. Alan woke at 6:30 a.m. on a crisp Tuesday morning, the house still shrouded in early dawn hush. Breakfast was simple: 2 eggs scrambled with cheese, toast lightly browned, and a warm mug of coffee. He called out softly, "Darius, ready?" But the reply was nothing more than a muffled shuffle from the hallway. When Darius finally emerged, he was already slipping on his backpack, earbuds in place. Alan put down the coffee, finished his cereal, and gently guided his steps toward the car. Once inside, the familiar tension filled the confined space. Darius sat rigidly in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead at the windshield. Alan adjusted. The rearview mirror glanced at Darius in the reflection and decided to risk a simple question. "Did you finish your math homework?" he asked, voice neutral. Darius responded with a terse shake of his head, fingers drumming his thigh. Alan pressed on. "I saw the assignment on the kitchen table last night. Think you can turn it in? On time?" From the silence, a single word emerged. "Maybe." Alan let it go and started the car, reversing down the driveway. The hum of the engine filled the compartment as they pulled onto the street. The neighborhood was quiet, save for a few early joggers and the distant roar of a lawnmower. Alan navigated the turns to the high school, trying again to break the ice. "How's Mr. Thompson's history class going? I remember you said he's pretty strict." Darius exhaled sharply, eyes flicking to Alan for the briefest moment. Then, back to the window. "It's fine," he replied. The blankness in his tone made Alan's chest tighten. He dropped the subject and continued the drive in silence. As they approached the busy intersection near the school, Darius turned down the volume on his music and for an instant seemed to consider something. Alan parked the car near the drop-off zone, turned off the engine and faced Darius directly. "I'm here if you need anything," he said, voice soft. "Doesn't mean I'm trying to take your place." Darius's eyes narrowed. "You ain't—" "My dad," he said bluntly, voice flat. Alan nodded as though he expected that. "I know," he replied quietly. "Doesn't change that I'm here for you. Darius exhaled, sliding quietly out of the car. Alan watched him walk up the sidewalk, headphones back on, backpack swinging with each step. He closed the car door, sighed, and settled into the driver's seat to wait for Marie's call confirming she was home safe. Inside, his thoughts wandered to the countless mornings that would feel just like this, words that missed their mark, silence that choked the air, but also a growing determination to remain present. Alan had no doubt the process would be slow. Building trust took time, especially when the other person believed every gesture was about control. Yet every morning, as he drove Darius to school, he silently vowed to try again, day after day, even if Darius refused to meet him halfway. For Alan, that promise felt like the only true path forward, a path paved with patience, empathy, and unwavering commitment. One Saturday afternoon, Alan dragged a large cardboard box from the garage into the driveway. Inside was a brand new basketball hoop, something Darius had mentioned wanting back when he still practiced with friends. Alan assembled the base, screwed the pole into place and adjusted the height until the hoop sat just above Darius's reach. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand as Marie watched from the front porch, offering an encouraging smile. "It's for you," Alan said, turning to where Darius stood in the doorway, arms crossed and eyes narrowed. "I remember you saying you wanted to shoot some hoops again." Darius glanced at the hoop, then back at Alan. There was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes, but he kept his mouth shut. Without a word, he picked up a worn basketball from inside the house and dribbled it a few times on the cracked driveway. The sound bounced off the walls and Alan leaned against the frame, hopeful that this shared activity might break through the wall between them. Darius gave a half-hearted bounce of the ball, then took a shot. The ball rimmed out. He caught it, scowled, and threw it to the ground so it rolled into a patch of grass. "It's not like I asked for this," he muttered. Alan shook his head slowly. "Thought you might enjoy having something to practice with if you ever felt like it." Darius didn't respond. The silence stretched until a neighbor's dog barked in the distance. Without warning, Darius stormed toward the hoop, grabbed the basketball and forcefully swung it at the backboard. The plastic cracked sharply under the blow, spiderwebbing across the surface. Alan's heart sank, but he stayed silent. He watched Darius take the metal rod from the yard, raise it, and with a hard strike shatter the backboard into pieces. Shards of transparent plastic scattered like confetti. Darius stood over the wreckage, chest heaving, fists clenching and unclenching. "I don't need this crap," he shouted, voice trembling. Alan remained calm even as his stomach twisted. He picked up a fragment of the shattered backboard, examined it briefly, then set it down. "I see," he said softly. "I'm sorry it upset you." Darius glared at him, then stormed back inside, slamming the door. Marie rushed forward, placing a hand gently on Alan's shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked, concern etched across her face. Alan nodded, though a lump formed in his throat. "I'm fine," he said. "It's just junk. Can rebuild or replace later." That night, Alan cleaned up the broken pieces in the dim glow of a flashlight. As he swept the driveway, he thought about how the simple gift had been perceived as an attempt to force his presence into Darius's life. He wasn't oblivious to the fact that Darius saw his efforts not as gestures of kindness, but as controlling moves. The weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. Inside, Darius sat on his bed, headphones still on but volume lower than usual. He stared at the wall, uncertainty flickering behind his eyes. Alan could have confronted him, demanded an apology, or lectured him about respect. Instead, he chose to clean up the physical mess and let space do the rest. In the quiet of the driveway, Alan whispered to himself, "I'll keep trying." He believed that someday Darius might understand that the broken hoop wasn't about control. It was about trying to bridge the gap. Until then, Alan would maintain his patience, one small act of care at a time. Alan woke early that Thursday, knowing Marie would be away for 3 nights on a work trip. Darius barely registered her departure, headphones already cocooning him from any household news. Alan planned to use the time to build more trust, though he knew Darius would resist every gesture. He decided to cook a simple dinner that evening, spaghetti with homemade sauce, garlic bread, and a side salad. If nothing else, the familiar aroma might coax Darius to the table. Around 6 o'clock, Alan began in the kitchen. He boiled water, sprinkled in a pinch of salt, and slid the spaghetti strands into the bubbling pot. As the noodles softened, he chopped onions, garlic, and fresh tomatoes for the sauce. He moved with purpose, humming softly under his breath. By the time the sauce simmered, the light from the kitchen windows softened, casting warm shadows across the countertops. Alan plated 2 servings, placed one carefully on the dining table, and set another on the countertop for himself. He could hear Darius's door open, then close again moments later. When Alan called out, "Dinner's ready," the response was silence. Darius shuffled into the kitchen, backpack dangling and earbuds around his neck. He leaned against the pantry doorframe, crossing his arms. Alan noticed the tension in Darius's posture and maintained a calm expression. "Spaghetti, tonight," Alan said, gesturing to the plates. Darius glanced at the food, then back at Alan. "I'm not eating," he said flatly. Alan nodded, placing his own plate on the table. He picked up his fork and took a bite, savoring the flavors. The garlic bread's crisp edge, the tang of the tomato sauce. It was simple, comforting. He hoped Darius might soften at the sight, but the boy's arms remained crossed. Alan paused mid-bite and said gently, "It's okay if you don't want to eat, but the offer's here." Darius rolled his eyes and turned away. Alan returned to his meal. Midway through chewing, he added, softly, "Subscribe if you ever felt like someone didn't understand your hunger, whether for food or for space." The words were casual, disguised as a joke. Darius froze, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Subscribe?" he echoed. Alan nodded, swallowing. "I mean, stay open to new things," he said quietly. Darius's expression tightened, but Alan noticed a hesitation as the boy considered the suggestion. Alan continued eating, leaving a forkful of spaghetti halfway to his mouth as he watched Darius. The younger man shifted, uncrossed his arms and glanced at the plate. But seconds later he brushed past Alan, saying, "I'll get a snack later," and retreated to his room. Alan sighed, finishing his meal in solitude. He cleaned the dishes, quietly, the clinking of plates echoing in the empty kitchen. Later, Alan found himself staring out the window into the backyard, the night still and calm. He felt a mix of disappointment and hope. He knew that the simple act of cooking dinner might not register with Darius as kindness, perhaps only as another attempt to control. Yet he believed that if he kept showing up, making small offers without pressure, Darius might one day understand. Maybe tomorrow, he thought, Darius would join him without a word, or maybe not. Either way, Alan resolved to keep trying, hope guiding him more than expectation. Darius had been avoiding Alan's gaze all day, retreating to his room the moment he got home from school. When Alan rounded the corner to the hallway and saw a mess of clothes scattered across the floor, a half-eaten sandwich on the desk, and textbooks piled haphazardly, he took a steadying breath. He knocked gently on the open doorway. "Darius, can we talk?" he asked. Darius looked up from his phone, eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" he said, voice clipped. Alan stepped inside and gestured to the clutter. "I noticed your room's pretty messy. Think you could clean it up?" Darius scoffed, tossing his phone onto the bed. "Why do you care?" he shot back, standing and facing Alan defiantly. Alan remained calm, folding his arms loosely. "I care because this is still your space and our home. When things get out of order, it affects everyone." Darius slammed his fist on the desk, rattling a stack of papers. "So you think you can just come in here and boss me around?" He spat, chest heaving. "I didn't ask you to be my parent," he added, his voice cracking with frustration. Alan's expression softened. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I'm not here to replace anyone. I just want to help keep the house in order, and that includes your room." Darius let out a harsh laugh. "You don't get it," he said, shaking his head. "All these helping things you do, they feel like you're taking control. Like I don't have a say." Alan bowed his head in understanding, but his voice remained gentle. "I didn't realize it felt that way to you. I thought fixing things and asking you to tidy up would show I care. Not that I want to control. You..." Pride gave way to a flicker of vulnerability in Alan's eyes. He reached out, placing a single hand on Darius's shoulder. Darius flinched, pulling away. "I'm sorry if it seems that way," Alan continued. "I just want us to work together as a family." Darius yanked his shoulder back, crossing his arms tightly. His eyes glistened, torn between anger and confusion. "You don't know anything about me," he muttered, turning away. Alan watched him for a moment, then took a breath and spoke softly. "I want to learn, but I need you to let me try. Can we compromise? Maybe you clean up your space on your own terms, in your own time. I'll give you the space you need." Darius paused, the silence thick. He looked at the disarray in his room, then back at Alan. The younger man's shoulders sagged slightly. "I don't know," he admitted quietly, avoiding Alan's gaze. Alan nodded, sensing the doorway to trust had opened, even if just a crack. "That's okay," he said. "We'll figure it out together. When you're ready, let me know." He gave a small, hopeful smile. Darius looked down at his shoes and nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The tension in the room remained, but a seed of understanding had been planted. Alan turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. He exhaled, leaning against the wood for a moment, then walked down the hallway. Although the mess in Darius's room wasn't yet cleared, Alan felt that today's conversation had shifted something. Perhaps this was the start of a path where each small step mattered more than immediate change. Either way, Alan resolved to keep showing respect, patience and kindness, hoping that over time Darius would see that his actions came from a place of care, not control. Darius trudged up the front steps later than usual one windy evening, his backpack slung low over one shoulder. Alan, sitting at the kitchen table sorting bills, looked up and froze. Darius's left eye was swollen shut, bruised purple and red. Alan set the papers aside and hurried over, concern washing over his face. "What happened?" he asked softly. Darius shrugged, looking away. "Got into it with Jalen," he mumbled. Alan nodded once, absorbing the unspoken truth. Jalen was a kid from school known to push Darius's buttons. Alan guided him to the living room couch and fetched a clean towel dampened with cool water. Gently, he placed it over Darius's eye. Darius flinched but didn't pull back. "That looks bad," Alan said quietly, keeping his voice gentle. Darius crossed his arms, closing his eyes under the cool cloth. "I'll live," he said. Alan didn't respond, instead retrieving a small first aid kit from the bathroom. He wrapped a soft bandage around Darius's eye socket, taking care not to press too hard. Darius's jaw clenched as Alan worked, but when Alan offered a comforting hand on his shoulder, Darius didn't pull away. Marie appeared in the doorway, concern etched on her face, and Alan shook his head so she'd know he had it under control. Once the bandage was secure, Alan helped Darius to sit upright. He got a glass of water and placed it on the coffee table. "I'll be right back," Alan said, heading toward the kitchen. He returned with a small plate of toast and a banana. "For you need something easy on your stomach," he explained quietly. Darius gave a half-hearted nod, still staring at the floor. He picked at the toast slowly as Alan watched, relief washing over him that Darius accepted the food. It was a small step. Alan sat on the arm of the couch, careful to keep his distance, yet close enough if Darius needed him. He didn't know what to say. Words felt inadequate. Instead, he offered a small smile. After a moment, Darius glanced up, eyes hooded but curious. "Thanks," he muttered, voice low. Alan's chest tightened. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. "You're welcome," Alan replied softly. They sat in companionable silence, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window pane. Darius took a sip of water, then leaned his head back against the cushion. Alan watched him, mind racing. He wanted Darius to understand that he cared not because he expected gratitude, but because that was what families did. He remembered how Darius had lashed out before, how the basketball hoop incident had shattered his hope for connection. But tonight felt different. There was no anger now, just vulnerability. Darius closed his eyes, and Alan quietly excused himself to do the dishes. As he scrubbed the plate clean, he thought about how this moment could mark a change. When he returned to the living room, Darius was still on the couch, breathing evenly. Alan sat down nearby, careful not to invade his space. After a few minutes, Darius shifted, looked at Alan, and offered a small, crooked smile. "Sorry for not trusting you," he whispered. It wasn't a full apology, yet in it lay a bridge built from shared silence and genuine care. Alan nodded, eyes misty, and simply said, "I'm here for you." In that quiet moment, without fanfare or drama, they both understood that sometimes actions spoke louder than words. Months turned into weeks and weeks into months, each day blending into the next with small, almost imperceptible shifts. The tension that once ruled the house gradually dissolved, like frost melting under a rising sun. Darius still kept his distance at times, retreating to his room when he sensed Alan approaching, but those moments grew shorter. Alan noticed the change in small gestures, the way Darius held the toolbox lid open for him, the extra effort he put into stacking firewood for the winter, or the way he lingered in the garage when Alan was tinkering with his old pickup. One Saturday morning, Alan was clearing leaves from the gutters when Darius appeared, holding a pair of leather gloves. "So you'll need these," he said, placing them carefully into Alan's waiting hands. Alan paused halfway up the ladder and looked down at Darius, surprised but grateful. The gesture spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement that Alan's efforts to maintain and protect the home were not unseen. Alan nodded and continued his work, the gloves fitting snugly over his hands as he removed debris and checked for leaks. Later that afternoon, as Alan mowed the lawn, Darius grabbed a leaf blower and began clearing the freshly cut grass from the driveway. They worked side by side, each focused on their own task, yet the shared activity felt like a conversation without words. When Alan finished, he clapped Darius gently on the back. "Nice work," he said sincerely. Darius offered a small nod, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It was progress, an unguarded moment of pride shared between them. Marie watched these moments with quiet relief. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table with home-cooked chicken fajitas, she took a sip of water and said, "Darius, Alan tells me you've been helping him pretty often." Darius shrugged, picking at a piece of chicken. Alan cut a slice of avocado and added it to his taco, then glanced at Darius. After a pause, Darius finally spoke, his tone softer than usual. "I guess I just figured, if he's still here, even when I try to push him away, maybe he genuinely cares." The room fell silent. Alan looked at Darius, eyes glistening with emotion. "That means a lot," Alan whispered, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. Darius didn't say "Dad" that night, but he didn't need to. Alan understood that titles could come later, if they ever came at all. What mattered was that trust was being rebuilt, brick by brick, in the quiet spaces between shared chores and unspoken understanding. Over the next few months, Darius began to seek Alan's advice more often, asking for help changing the oil in his bike or inquiring which paint color might suit the living room wall. Each question might have seemed small to an outsider, but to Alan, it signified a gesture of acceptance, a recognition that Alan's presence was not an attempt to control, but a desire to support and guide. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves turned golden and the air grew crisp, Alan found Darius sitting on the front porch steps reading a comic book. Alan joined him with 2 mugs of hot cocoa, handing one to Darius without a word. Darius accepted it, taking a careful sip. "Thanks," he said quietly. Alan simply nodded, content to sit in companionable silence, watching the leaves swirl around them. In that moment, father and son, by choice, not by blood, shared the warmth neither dared to imagine when Alan first moved in. It wasn't perfect, and they weren't best friends yet, but they were family in the making. And that, Alan knew, was enough.